As we reach the end of October and the modern interpretation of Halloween, I hope you have liked the regular and special presentations I have been able to do for you. But I think it is important to remember that many of the Halloween staples that we today see as fun were once anything but. Take, for example, witches, seen as the root of all evil and the cause of many people's problems in the past, often with terrible results, as we have covered in the past with the Lowestoft witch trials. And of course, along with the suspected witches came the men who claimed to hunt them. There are relatively few people whose names alone, even today, can bring condemnation, and led to reactions of anxiety and fear during their lifetime. Our subject this week holds this rather dubious distinction. Seen by some as a misguided man of extreme faith, led to do terrible things in order to what he thought was protecting his nation from a perceived creeping evil, and to others an unrepentant psychopath who took advantage of a country being torn apart by civil war to lead a campaign of terror throughout the country, leading to the deaths of hundreds. His name was Matthew Hopkins, and he was the Witchfinder General. As with many of the time not born into nobility, very little is known about Matthew's early life. What is known is he was born in the Suffolk village of Great Wentham, sometime either in 1619 or 1620, and he was the fourth son of 6 children born to James Hopkins, the vicar of St. John's in Great Wentham. A die-hard Puritan, James was seemingly well respected and a popular man among his parishioners, and would die in 1643, leaving Matthew a good inheritance. Matthew Hopkins' interest in witchcraft started early, taking a keen interest in reading books on witch hunting, something that had become rather an obsession throughout England since the late 1590s. Matthew moved from Suffolk in the 1640s, settling only 10 miles away from the village of his birth in Manningtree in Essex. He established himself as a gentleman and bought the Thorn Inn in Mistley. It is also possible that during this time he studied and became a lawyer, but lack of any real evidence puts forward that possibly it was a rather self-appointed achievement on his own part, and certainly would not be the only time in his life he would carry out such an action. With any experience he had actually practicing law, he clearly was not a very good lawyer, and soon found himself rather poor. Hopkins' journey into the world of witch trials began in March 1644, when he claimed to overhear several women from Manningtree discussing the meetings they had with the devil. The growing numbers of accusations of witchcraft in the town soon led to the arrival of a witch hunter, John Sterne, himself also a Suffolk man from Long Melford, and it didn't take long for Matthew, aged just 24, to appoint himself as his assistant, marking the beginning of their rather grim partnership. The trial would be held the following year in Chelmsford, and would set the standard for things to come. There was a large number of defendants. 33 women stood accused of witchcraft, of which only 10 would walk free. 4 died while awaiting trial in prison, and 19 were convicted and hanged. The Chelmsford trial was the making of Sterne and Hopkins, possibly even gaining them official commission from Parliament to hunt and persecute witches, although, once again, the legitimacy of this commission has often been called into question. Regardless if it was real or not, it was all the pair needed to begin their crusade to both village and town across East Anglia, turning countless lives on their head. Their reign of terror had begun. These two working together soon accounted for more witches being put to death than had happened in the last 160 years. As they journeyed around the region, Hopkins soon became the more driven of the pair. This is not to say Sterne was not committed to his work, but Matthew had a zeal for what they were doing, brought on by his puritanical upbringing. For much of the history of witch hunting in England, the goal was more to determine if the accused had used their alleged powers to harm or damage the property of others. But this was not the approach taken by Hopkins. For him, it was to prove they had communicated with the devil, whether they were guilty for actual crimes or not. Of course, it is not possible to talk about Matthew Hopkins without mentioning his methods of interrogation to get confessions. Now, these were methods he certainly did not invent, but you could be argued he perfected. Many of the old forms of gaining information in earlier witch hunts were now out of reach, as torture had been outlawed in England. But there were still methods that today would be classed as torture available. Sleep deprivation was one still permitted by law, and Hopkins was always careful to stay within the law. This would lead to a process known as watching, where the accused would be watched in their cells for days on end, not allowed to rest or sleep, or in certain cases even sit down. They were followed by inspections for witches' marks, where the victims were stripped and inspected, and if this didn't lead to some kind of confession, there was always walking, forced exercise to the point of collapse. This, mixed with several days of watching, confessions soon came. And this brings us to possibly the most famous of all the witch tests, Ordeal by water, or the swimming test, where the suspected witch was tied up, with their right thumb tied to their left toe, and their left thumb tied to their right toe, and were lowered into the water by a rope. Those who swam or floated were considered witches, as it was believed when they made a deal with the devil they had rejected their baptisms, and so water rejected them, and those who drowned were considered to be innocent. Now, it must be pointed out that this method was not without its critics, and Hopkins was warned several times for using it, as it was technically assault to do it without a person's permission, and if they died, it could be considered murder. But, as mentioned before, as he was no longer investigating crimes and purely investigating the work of the devil, many local authorities saw these laws relaxed for him. Although it was not uncommon for Hopkins' investigations to not need to go as far as the swimming tests, and was often solely discovered by the aforementioned witches' marks, sometimes also known as devil's marks, something that every witch and sorcerer was said to have on their body, believed to be either the spot that the devil had kissed, or that they used to feed their familiars. Evil helpers the witch could use to carry out their crimes against their victims, generally disguising themselves as animals such as cats and dogs. But any kind of animal could be accused of being one, and sometimes even children were. For the marks to be found, the accused was stripped naked, and often shaved, ready for the Witchfinder's teams, made of women known as lady pickers to inspect them in more detail. In truth, the so-called marks were often innocent moles or birthmarks, scars or stretches, and nothing more than that. And even if the victim was fortunate enough not to have anything like this did not mean they were in the clear. Men like Hopkins were paid for the witches they found, so they often went out of their way to find them. Invisible markings soon became very popular, as well as finding areas of the body that did not bleed when stabbed with a knife or pin. It is long believed that in times like this, a special knife, with a blade that simply retracted back into the handle when pressed against something, were used to quickly establish guilt. Rather interestingly, and somewhat suspiciously, in almost all of his cases, the confessions Hopkins claimed he was able to get from the witches were strikingly similar, and in certain times practically identical. The woman was someone from the outskirts of the community, who was seduced by the devil, and given a familiar to bring terror to their neighbours by killing their livestock, children, or making them sick, and generally some underlying grievance between the confessing witch and their victims was always there under the surface. The first woman to fall victim to Hopkins' puritanical justice was 80-year-old Elizabeth Clarke, and she seemed to almost be a stereotype of the kind of woman who would be accused for witchcraft. Old, widowed, childless, and seen by many locals as a very strange person, Matthew subjected her to sleep deprivation for 3 days, being forced to stand for the whole time, a near impossible task given that Elizabeth only had one leg. Unable to endure the process any longer, she confessed to being in league with the devil and was promptly hanged. It can be hard for us now to look back on these witch trials and see them as anything but some terrible hysteria that seems to have sprung from nowhere. But in doing this, we overlook the ongoing situation in the country as a whole. In many ways, religious wars had raged all over England since Henry VIII left the Catholic Church in 1536. But, along with many other reasons and grievances, things had finally come to a head in 1642, when the country exploded into open civil war, fought between King Charles I, although himself a Protestant, was married to a Catholic, who fought bitterly against the Protestant parliamentarian forces. Years of bitterness and hate were let loose all over the country, with battles and the capture of cities and towns often followed by massacres from both sides. And when the parliamentarians, under the command of Oliver Cromwell, finally emerged victorious, in total the war had claimed the lives of 3.6% of the English population. And in comparison, the First World War cost the lives of 2.6. East Anglia, where Matthew Hopkins plied his trade, was not just an area with heavy Protestant sympathy. It was the heartland of the Puritans, being the birthplace of several who would lead for the New World on board the Mayflower, as well as Cambridgeshire being the home of Oliver Cromwell himself. Due to this, the area was spared much of the fighting seen by other parts of the country, although King's Lynn in North Norfolk did come out in favour of the king and was put to siege, but we will cover that in the future. Despite this, it would be wrong to say everything in the area was running as normal. Much of the young male population was away at war. Tensions were running high, with people looking for anyone who might not be on their side. The regular court system had all but broken down, and with this system taken away, many were willing to do anything to get results and paybacks for perceived wrongs that had been done against them. Added to this powder keg was the bad luck of weather. Heavy rain had destroyed huge swathes of the region's crops, leaving many, especially among the poor, hungry. And given the area's strong religious ties and the people's devotion to their cause and to their God, how could this be happening to them? Their fathers, sons and brothers were out fighting to maintain their faith. Why would God allow this to happen to them? The answer was plain. It had to be the work of witches, in league with the devil, conspiring against them, with some going as far as to believe they were living in the final days before Judgment Day, using anything they saw as proof. Have there not been strange comets seen in the air, prodigies, sights of the sea, marvellous tempests and storms on the land? Have not nature altered her course so much that women, famed of pure flesh and blood, bringeth forth ugly and deformed monsters? With this background, it shouldn't be seen as too odd that men like Matthew Hopkins were able to operate with near impunity. And I feel it should be noted that in all probability he honestly believed in what he was doing. Sometimes working with Stern, and other times alone, Hopkins would not only travel all over East Anglia on his seemingly never-ending hunt, but he would leave at times, going as far as Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. And as his reputation grew, he spent little time looking for work, rather now being invited to towns, cities and villages who felt they had a problem and were eager to remove these evil spirits from their communities. The sight of Hopkins and his little camp of followers must have been a chilling sight to any local who felt they may fall into suspicion. Some mayors of more poorer towns were probably not fond of him either, as although he was a true believer, he did charge for the service, claiming to charge a town 20 shillings plus travel expenses, although records showed that a stint in Newmarket cost the town £28, £3,291.29 today. Although it is very true that it is mostly poor women who fell under the suspicion that led to them standing trial, they were not targeted exclusively. When he came to the village of Brandeston in Suffolk, it was the village vicar of all people, 70-year-old John Lowes, whose only crime seems to have been being rather unpopular with his parishioners. His position in the church did not save him from Hopkins' normal methods of questioning, being reported that he kept him awake for several nights together while running him backwards and forwards about his cell until out of breath. After a brief rest, he ran him again, and thus they did for several days and nights together, till he was weary of his life and scarce sensible of what he said or did. It was in such a state of mind that Lowes finally confessed. He had covenanted with the devil, suckled familiars being Tom, Flo, Bess and Mary for 5 years, and had bewitched cattle. He had also caused a ship to sink off Harwich, with the loss of 14 lives. No record of such a shipwreck was ever found. He would stand trial along with other locals in what could be claimed as Hopkins' most famous trial, the 1645 trial in Bury St Edmunds. Hopkins was now fully proclaiming himself as Witchfinder General, a title that it is most likely that he totally invented. It was a somewhat rushed affair, as elements of the Royalist army were advancing into nearby Cambridgeshire, and given this, many wondered if this was the best use of everyone's time. But for the moment, Hopkins was not a man to be questioned. In the Rush state, evidence was overlooked or pushed aside, and claims that the confessions had been made under torture were totally ignored. When the trial ended, John Lowes was sentenced to death along with 17 others. Due to this being allegations of witchcraft and working with the devil, the church would not bless any of the people as they went to the scaffold. John Lowes carried out his own service as he walked to his death. In many ways, though, this trial would mark the beginning of the end of Hopkins and his band. For so many to hang had rarely happened before, and many were starting to question both his methods and his apparent position given to him by Parliament, possibly realising this and wanting to make the most of being Witchfinder General. He stepped up his operations to an almost machine level of efficiency. He paid 3 visits to Norfolk in 1646. The first saw 20 die for witchcraft, and the later 2, in the September and December, brought him to the area of Great Yarmouth, but it is not known how many lives they claimed. This final spurt of terror brought him and his followers all over the region, from Ipswich to Stowmarket to Aldborough and King's Lynn, bringing fear and paranoia with them. But it would be this attitude, the zeal in which he persecuted the condemned, and of course his greed, that would lead to his downfall. By the end of 1646, Hopkins was a name to be feared, even in areas he had never set foot in. So it must have taken a good deal of bravery for John Gall, the vicar of Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire, himself a Puritan, to be the first to publicly stand against him. Upon hearing that the Witchfinder was on his way to his little corner of the world, Gould began to speak out against him and his actions, even openly preaching against the witch trials from his pulpit. But he was determined that it should be more than just his word against his actions, as in the end this would stand for very little. He began to gather evidence that he believed was showing the outlawed methods of torture were being used on totally innocent people. Every old woman with a wrinkled face, a furrowed brow, a hairy lip, a robber tooth, a squint eye, a squeaking voice or scolding tongue, having a rugged coat on her back, a skull cap on her head, a spindle in her hand, and a dog or cat by her side, is not only suspected but pronounced for a witch. He published his findings in a book. This seemed to be the opening of the dam that had been holding back criticism of Hopkins. And as word spread, bit by bit, his power and credibility were being chipped away. And it did not take long for something that only a few months ago would have been unthinkable. People began to question him, his methods, and how he was charging for the service. In Norfolk, local justices tore into him for his unlawful use of torture in open court. On top of this, a rumour soon sprung up that the only way he was able to find so many witches was to be in league with the devil himself, and be given a book by the devil that contained the names of every witch in England. The growing pressure and hatred against him led to Hopkins and his band of followers going their separate ways in the early months of 1647, with him returning to Manningtree and writing the book The Discovery of Witches, in which he fought back against many of the accusations levelled at him, but it would do little good. The book was written sometime in May, and only 3 months later Matthew Hopkins was dead. His death came on the 11th of August 1647. In more fanciful tales of his life, he meets his end through a vengeful crowd, who either believed him to have been a witch this whole time, or simply wanted to see him gone, subjecting him to many of his own methods of interrogation, including the swimming test, before hanging him on the spot, just as he had done to so many. But this seems to be little more than a story, with it now being largely believed that he died of tuberculosis, aged 28 or 29, and was buried the same day in an unmarked grave in the now long-gone church of St Mary's at Mistley Heath. Although witch mania, as it was known, would carry on all around the world, it would never reach this level of ferocity in England again. It is established that between the 15th and 18th century, 500 people, mostly women, were killed in England for suspected witchcraft. The actions of Hopkins account for as many as 300 of these cases in just 3 years. Had Hopkins not died when he did, with the attitudes of witchfinders rapidly changing in his home country, it is possible that he would have made for the English colonies in North America, where its own witch mania sprung up the year after his death, beginning with Margaret Jones in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and would run into the 1690s. It was a journey that Hopkins himself was unable to make, but his work and methods most certainly did. Many of his ideas were used in the mentioned Jones case, and even some of them finding limited use in the Salem witch trials that led to the death of 19 people, including 3 from Hopkins' old area of operations, with Rebecca Nurse and Mary Estrie originally coming from Great Yarmouth, and John Proctor being born in Suffolk. The area has other connections to the Salem witch trials as well, which we will cover on a later date. Matthew Hopkins is a man long remembered, both through history and the numerous fictional accounts of his life, many of which have led to the more dramatic ending which I told you earlier, and probably one, in all honesty, that he deserved. But this brings us to the end not just of this presentation, but of all of our ones of October. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, and this was a little bit of history.